Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome, I believe, back to the program. I mean, I know that we've talked in the past many times, I have a feeling. Reporting fellow with Type Investigations and author of Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. Sarah Posner, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Sam.
I feel like right now I can't remember anything, but I know we had you on for your last book, I believe, and also countless stories over the years. And you have been reporting on evangelicals and the Christian and Christian movement, I guess, in this country for I think like 15 years. I mean, as long as I can remember.
A long time.
And so let's just start with this. When we say white evangelicals, who are we talking about? Like what? Like, give us a sense of who these people are, because I think your reporting, certainly over the past couple of years, has exposed that they're not necessarily who we would think they are, at least in terms of the way that they practice their lives. Let's put it that way.
Well, white evangelicals make up a big chunk of the Republican Party base, and they are also a crucial part of what's known as the religious right or the Christian right, which is also an alliance with right-wing Catholics and conservative mainline Protestants. But white evangelicals are the driving force of the religious right and of Trump's presidency. And so this is people who largely attend evangelical churches, Pentecostal churches, charismatic churches. These might be churches that are affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention or a non-denominational church that practices faith healing, or a non-denominational church that promotes the prosperity gospel. So it's not one single theological unit, but they share a common theological belief that they're born again in Jesus Christ and they have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And more than any other religious demographic, they're very politically homogenous. 81% of them voted for Donald Trump in 2016.
How often do they go to church? I mean, how pious? I mean, I identify as a Jew, but I don't. But there's a huge difference in my worldview than, let's say, maybe a Jew who lives in a Hasidic community, in a different part of Brooklyn. How pious, how practicing are they? They belong to these churches. I'm just trying to get a sense of, because I think I saw one study back where folks would identify as being evangelical Christians, but then also say, like, I don't really go to church though.
Right. I think the thing that's important to understand is that churches obviously play a really important role in evangelicals' lives, but in terms of their political identity or their political ideology, it's way more than church, right? So there's church where they might go once a week or maybe even less often. But then maybe there's also the Wednesday night Bible study, or the televangelists that they like watching on TV, or conferences that they like to go to, the newsletters they get from the Family Research Council or the Faith and Freedom Coalition or any number of political groups, or the Facebook pages that they subscribe to. So it's not just church itself, but it's a wider cultural and political community that reinforces a lot of the political beliefs and ideology. And in the Trump era, conspiracy theories and, claims about who Trump is and who Trump's enemies are, for example.
Right. And I want to get into that, but we need to understand white evangelicals as much as a cultural group as it is a religious group in that sense, right? I mean, it's a culture that is built around a religion, but it is a culture in the sense that they're getting their media, their music, they're socializing, their how-tos on raising kids and their education. All of these things are they're all sort of like they're all culturally consistent.
Right. And culturally connected. So you could go to a conference where you would meet people from all over the country who might be familiar with each other's pastors or each other's quote unquote teachers, because they have a very robust media ecosystem where various teachers or pastors are broadcast all over the country. So you're not just learning from or getting cultural or theological reinforcement from your own pastor, but it's a wider circle of ideas and media and ideology.
Is it safe to say that Donald Trump was not immersed in this culture at any point in his life?
Well, he was immersed in a certain aspect of this culture, which is very important to their political organizing, and that is televangelism. So the story about Trump goes that he went to Norman Vincent Peale's church when he was a kid. Of course, Norman Vincent Peale is famous for the power of positive thinking, but probably more importantly for Trump's political organizing, he became interested in the televangelist Paula White in the early to mid 2000s. And the story that Trump's friends and allies like to tell is that he likes to channel surf. He likes to channel surf to Christian television. And he saw Paula White on her television show, and he wanted to meet her. And he had his secretary call her up, and he brought her to Trump Tower, and they've been friends ever since. And she's now considered to be his top spiritual advisor, and she even has an official advisor role in the White House to his faith-based initiative. So he was not necessarily immersed in going to church, but he was very immersed in this prosperity gospel culture where they teach that God wants you to be rich, and a sign of God's blessing is that you are rich. God wants you to be healthy, but only those who have faith in God are going to be healthy and have the ability to heal themselves or experience miraculous healing or miraculous riches. And so to the extent that he was immersed in that world, that was what first connected him to the Christian right.
Do we have a sense of what it was about when he's watching, what's he looking for when he's doing that? I mean, he's doing, I imagine he had political aspirations back then, but I don't know. Do you think that's what he was doing, or was it just like he was looking at this like, this could be a potential business for me, or maybe he wants to learn how do you do like direct marketing? I mean, what?
It's hard to tell. The way the story was conveyed to me by Johnny Moore, who's also one of Trump's religious advisors, evangelical advisors, was that Trump was just channel surfing, and he happened on Paula White, and she was giving a sermon on what was called, the title of it was The Value of Vision, and that it had a lot to do with being able to have a vision for your business life or your business success. And this is what appealed to him as a businessman, that there was some connection between believing in the Bible or something you could find in the Bible and having a successful business. He may have had other motivations as well that I don't know about, but that was the way the story was conveyed to me.
Fair enough. And so, okay, so he has at least a sense of like of what's going on and on some of the communications wing of this. So how does he go? Well, he is considered by some of these folks, and I mean, largely this is a story of hypocrisy, but I'm not 100% sure if that's the case. Like I get the transactional stuff, and we'll get to that, right? I mean, that to me, it makes total sense. But there are people in this community who it appears genuinely believe that he is chosen by God to deliver for them.
Yeah.
And will you go into that and the sort of like the idea of, and I guess maybe this speaks to sort of like what some people would call an authoritarianism streak within
Yeah.
religious followers, but the idea of a strong man.
Right. So the Christian right believes that God intended for America to be founded America, played a role in founding America as a Christian nation, and that America's Christian heritage has been under attack by secularism, by feminism, by social justice warriors, by political correctness, by socialism, right? So like they have I'm sorry?
Me.
By you.
Yes,
yes,
and folks like me. Yes.
And so the through line of my book, which is about how the Christian right came to mobilize around Donald Trump alongside the alt-right, and that a lot of this had to do with race as well as religion, right? But a through line of the book is that they don't like a liberal democracy. They don't like a pluralistic, secular democracy. And so Trump comes along and he is willing to cast aspersions on all of their bogeyman that they've been developing over the past several decades. He's willing to claim on their behalf that their religious freedom is under siege, and he's going to save their religious freedom from all of these terrible forces that are infringing on it. And so even though Trump doesn't have any particular history with opposing abortion or even opposing LGBTQ rights before he starts running for president, they come to accept him and embrace him as this savior who is going to use illiberal or undemocratic means to achieve their vision for America that they think has been lost to all of these terrible liberal forces.
And what amazes me that you write about in this is that there's this real sense that they who come to that conclusion are the congregants, right? Like that largely the leadership of white evangelicals across the board, they were sort of following their congregations.
So there were a few people, well-known people who got on board early with Trump. People will probably remember Robert Jeffress, well, Paula White, obviously, because she had been on board with him for a while. And Robert Jeffress, who's now one of his top religious advisors. He's a megachurch pastor from Dallas. He endorsed Trump fairly early. And then there was a lot of attention on Jerry Falwell Jr., who endorsed Trump right before the primaries got underway. But largely the leadership was headed towards somebody like Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio or even Ben Carson. But what they found was the grassroots was loving Trump, and Trump, in this crowded field of people with a lot of evangelical cred, like Cruz and Rubio and Scott Walker and a host of other people in that huge field, Trump was getting a plurality of evangelical support, according to polling. And so once it became obvious that Trump was just steamrolling over these other candidates and that the grassroots was really mobilized behind him, more of the leadership started to fall into line.
All right, so let's talk about the mechanics. Well, let's get to, I guess, like what the grievances that you write about that bind these folks. I'm trying to get to, like, what it is about Trump that that even the congregation responded to, right? I mean, they're not the ones who are going to be convinced or are sitting in a room where Trump is, transactionally saying, like, look, this is what I'm going to deliver for you. I don't know if it's going to be a wad of cash or whatever it is, but or just, religious freedom, executive orders or whatever it is. What is it? what is it that binds these folks? Like, what was it that Trump was saying that was basically making white evangelicals feel like this is a guy who may not have walked the walk, but he is
Mm-hmm.
going to protect our interests? I mean, what were those interests?
So well, first of all, abortion has become a top issue for them. And so you're right, to a certain extent, this was transactional. He promised judges or Supreme Court justices who would overturn Roe versus Wade. That was a big deal.
But every Republican does. I mean, more or less, right? Maybe he does it a little bit more explicitly, but they all more or less do that.
Right. So, but that's an important deal sealer. But I think more crucially for the base was Trump's way of speaking, right? His way of articulating grievances about, I mean, when you think about the early stages of his campaign, when he was running in the primary, he had grievances about Black Lives Matter. He had grievances about immigrants. He had grievances about political correctness in general, or globalists, or just this litany of what is perceived by the base to be liberal ideas or scapegoats that they have come to believe has changed that Christian America that they believe God intended the country to be. And so they see Trump as coming in and just being what some of them call a wrecking ball or a disruptor, and that he's unafraid to just smash it all to bits so that there can be this revitalization of the Christian America that God intended. And so a lot of this has to do with their perception of, say, church-state separation as an infringement of their religious freedom, or marriage equality as necessarily an infringement of their religious freedom. So to the extent that civil rights for other people are seen as a, there's like to them a push-pull or an equal and opposite reaction, where those rights necessarily mean an infringement of their rights as Christians. Trump was articulating that in a way that didn't soft pedal it at all, didn't bend to what they thought was political correctness or bipartisanship. And that was very appealing, to have this staunch warrior on their behalf.
So to what extent have we seen a change in the numbers of the people that voted for Trump? In other words, like, I'm trying to get a sense of how much of, one of the narratives that we hear now, obviously this cohort, white evangelicals, were key to Trump's victory. It seems to me, like he's not able to mobilize these people. Forget it. You can't run as a Republican unless they're going to support you.
Right.
To what extent, like, how large has that demographic, that cohort, where is that in terms of its growth trajectory, A, and B? And I ask that because one of the narratives that came out of his election was that we are having, the life expectancy of white males dropped around that time as a function largely of the opioid problem, but it also was sort of coexisting with a drop in wages and real wages, and small towns and rural areas in particular, and older cities being depleted. And I wonder, like, where does the material experience of these people come into this? Has their numbers changed as situations have gotten worse for people, like economically and whatnot? Or, where does that play into it? Or was that completely irrelevant in the context? Did they just, their voting cues, the things that motivate them, are just completely divorced from that material world?
I think for the most part, yes, they are. But I think the demographic changes that are happening, which are resulting in white evangelicals being a smaller part of the U.S. population overall, has to do with younger people, say the 18 to 29-year-olds or the 18 to 40-year-olds being less white and also less religious, right? So that has diminished the percentage of white evangelicals vis-a-vis the rest of the population. However, the really important thing to remember in terms of elections is that they make up about 25% of the electorate, right? So they vote they're very robust voters, and that's in part because of the culture that we talked about at the top, where the church and the televangelists and the political organizations reinforce each other with very robust and effective get out the vote operations. And they make up about, a third of the Republican electorate. So Trump knows this, where, the people around Trump know this, and the religious right political organizations on the ground are working very hard as we speak to mobilize white evangelicals and white conservative Catholics and other Christians to the polls in support of Trump, because of his base, right, they're the sort of most consistent voters and have the most organized get out the vote machinery.
Let's talk about the politicization of these folks and the grounds on which they were politicized. There's the story of, I think it was Weirich meeting with religious leaders in the mid to late 70s as they're trying to figure out, like, what topic can we use? What issue can we use to mobilize folks? And you have it was abortion, supposedly. You have an amendment to that story, or maybe a revision slightly.
So Paul Weirich was one of the main architects of the religious right. He came to Washington in the late 1960s. He helped build this movement called the New Right, which, it was new at the time, right? And he was trying to organize a coalition of conservatives who rejected what you might sort of shorthandedly call country club conservatism or country club republicanism. And as part of that, he believed that he really needed to bring in religious voters, that they were going to be a really important part of this kind of middle America white coalition of voters that was going to remake the Republican Party. And he was a very right-wing Catholic. And so he had all along been opposed to abortion, but he could not get these evangelicals and fundamentalists that he was working with excited about the abortion issue in the 1970s. This is in the lead up to the formation of the moral majority in 1979. But by Weirich's own admission and by the historical record, the evangelicals and fundamentalists who got involved with forming the moral majority were animated by something else entirely. And that was the federal government's efforts to desegregate private and private Christian schools in the wake of the school desegregation of public schools that happened after Brown v. Board of Education. And so this idea that the government was infringing on the religious rights of these Christian schools by demanding, according to them, quote unquote, quotas of Black students that needed to go to their Christian schools, that was a great infringement of their religious liberty. And this formed the basis for a lot of the political organizing, even to this day, for the Christian right, where you'll see them invoking Bob Jones University, which was the most well-known of these cases, where Bob Jones University, a fundamentalist college in South Carolina, had its tax exemption revoked because of its racist policies. It had a policy against interracial dating on campus. And it was a Supreme Court case. I mean, they claimed that this was a great violation of their religious freedom. So what you see today, even today, religious right activists will claim that, the IRS is going to take away the tax exemption of churches or nonprofit organizations that oppose same-sex marriage. And so this kind of idea that the government is the enemy of the religious freedom of these Christians pervades the religious right decades later. But the reality is that it was these racial grievances, not abortion, that initially got these activists involved in the moral majority and the other organizations that formed at that time. And it was only later that abortion, that they sort of got on board with the abortion issue, and that later became their top organizing issue.
There's two things that strike me. One is that there is a sense now, and we just saw Josh Hawley come out with a big litmus test for abortion, that abortion is not just a litmus test for abortion. It is that if you are all in on, as a judge, on limiting the right of a woman to get an abortion, then there is a sense amongst those folks that you line up straight down the line on every other issue that is super important. And so abortion becomes sort of like a talisman on some level. If you cross that threshold, everything else lines up perfectly. And you don't even have to ask about, where they are on corporate rights, or where they are on the rights of let's say, accused criminals, or where they are on a whole host of other issues that are completely unrelated. But that if you line up a hardcore anti-abortion, you're going to be okay on all the other things down the line, at least in the judicial level. And then the other thing that strikes me as you say that is that construction of infringement of religious freedom, where we're not going to give you we're not going to give you tax-free status, which is really like, we're just not going to give you this special privilege. That construction is more in play in this era than I think at any other time in between, it seems to me.
Well, it's interesting because it's the right that has made the question of, my tax dollars are funding abortion, or my tax dollars are funding contraception. They've really made that such a key issue for them. The idea that there might be some penny or dollar somewhere in Obamacare that's using taxpayer funding for abortion. Yet their complaint about the government enforcement of what is not only stated government policy, but the law, on civil rights and school desegregation and LGBT rights and same-sex marriage, that they think it's okay for the taxpayers to basically be subsidizing their nonprofit organizations despite their opposition to these civil rights for other people. And the other thing that's kind of crazy about all of that is that the IRS has not done this, right? Like, nobody has gotten their tax exemption taken away for any of these reasons. And certainly no church has had their tax exempt status taken away because of their opposition to same-sex marriage. So, but yes, abortion becomes the top litmus test issue, but it's connected with all of these notions about what is their religious freedom and what is the role of the government in enforcing rights for other people when it comes up against what they claim is their religious rights.
To what extent is Mike Pence? What role does he play in this one? Because I've been told that by one of his biographers that Mike Pence is the most powerful is the most powerful theocrat that we have had in this country's history, as he sits as a vice president, as a sitting vice president. Is that your sense, A, and B, like what does Mike Pence do in this world? Is he the one, because you talk about Health and Human Services as being a very important, sort of a center for a lot of these folks, but you can also see them like Betsy DeVos and sure, Mike Pompeo and just about every other
Bill Barr.
I don't think people fully realize how religious this administration is. Is Mike Pence the guy who's basically saying, like, this guy hits, both your list, Donald Trump, which is he's loyal and and he's willing to, maybe be cut a couple corners, and also the religious right because this guy's dyed in the wool. I mean, what is Pence doing in that administration?
So I think that Pence initially was picked because he had so much cred with the religious right. I mean, dating back to the time before he was a congressman, he had a radio show in Indiana. He was a very respected, admired congressman for the Christian right when he served in Congress and later as governor of Indiana. And so I think originally I thought that he was just going to be like the bridge or the person who gave Trump the imprimatur for the base. But as I've watched him interact with Trump and interact with the base over the course of Trump's presidency, and watching how the Christian right really went to bat for Trump during impeachment, when you might have thought, well, so what if Trump were to get impeached, because they would have Pence, and Pence is willing to do all of the policy things that Trump is willing to do for them. So what gives here? And I really think that Pence sort of models for them what it's like to submit to Trump. I know that sounds a little bit terrifying and wild, but
and super creepy.
If you watch him, he's very submissive to Trump, and submission to authority, especially divine authority, is very important in this culture. And I think that the role that he's played, especially in the later years of Trump's presidency, has been to show how you are submissive to Trump.
I'm sorry. It's just like so creepy to me, that dynamic. And it really, I guess I'm thinking about those like Dear Leader roundtables they have where they sit around a conference room and everybody goes is like, you are, it's like this, they're paying tribute, right? I mean, it's, one of them's going to bring their firstborn son and slay them on the table right in front of them, I guess.
I think that it's really important to understand that submission to authority and what is perceived as godly authority is playing a role here in terms of how Pence and other members of Trump's cabinet, who may say negative or disparaging things about him in private that, White House reporters get wind of off the record, right? But in public, they're extremely dutiful and submissive to him. And I think that's their reading of the base's view of Trump as this kind of authority or savior figure.
So when we get stuff like Trump is, the comparing, there's a Trump Cyrus the Great coin, which you can buy online. Mm-hmm. Like, are those? Who's developing those and putting them out? I'm not saying specifically the coin, although I'd be curious about that. But I mean, who's like, are these developments of these comparisons like serving a similar function as Mike Pence sort of modeling to everybody on, how he is compliant with the alpha?
Well, I think with the Cyrus comparison, that is intended to deflect the argument that Trump isn't a Christian, right? So, like, I think by any measure, by a liberal reading of Christianity or a conservative reading of Christianity, it's hard to argue that Trump is a Christian. And so the Cyrus comparison has been used to say, well, look, sometimes God chooses unlikely leaders to save a nation at a critical point in its history. So in the Bible, King Cyrus was the Persian king who helped the exiled Jews return to Jerusalem and rebuild the holy city. The analogy there is that God has sent Trump to save America and rebuild a Christian America, even though he seems like an unlikely person for God to choose because he's not of the same religion as the people who are having their nation rebuilt. And so that's where the Cyrus thing came from.
Who developed that?
Like the coins and
I mean, where does that come from? Does that come spontaneously, or does
I can't remember who the first person to say it was, but it became very popular in charismatic and Pentecostal circles. There's this evangelist, his name is Lance Wallnau. He's promoted it a lot. He's also promoted the wrecking ball theory that, Trump is a wrecking ball. He's going to come and destroy everything because everything just needs to be ruined and like rebuilt. And so it became a very widespread meme, and to the extent that somebody's trying to make money off of it from the coins, which I actually haven't seen, that's not particularly surprising because that's kind of the Trump way, right? To like make money off of selling these trinkets, but selling trinkets is also very, very common in the prosperity gospel circles. Televangelists are always hawking, trinkets and anointing oil and all sorts of things.
So lastly, what's happening with COVID? I mean, when Trump is losing support, is he losing any support in this community? And I imagine a lot of his loss of support is a function of his response to COVID. I think we're seeing that, elderly people are like, you know what, I'm not on board with this.
Right.
I got to die for everybody else thing. Is that what's happening in the evangelical community? Is something similar going on, or is it completely immune, I guess, not to stretch the analogy from this?
So, there's some polling that his approval ratings among white evangelicals have dipped into the 60s, which they have over the course of his first campaign and presidency. They've sort of fluctuated between the mid 60s to the high 70s. Yet the one poll to poll this question with white evangelicals, their approval of him during the COVID pandemic, to also ask the question, but hey, are you still going to vote for him in November, was Pew. And so they found that something like he only had like a 60-something% approval rating among white evangelicals, but 82% of them said they were still going to vote for him nonetheless. So I think that's the really important question in that polling is, okay, you might not be thrilled with the way he's handling the coronavirus, but, you're going to vote for him nonetheless. And I think that in terms of the leadership, I think it's a combination of just kind of ignoring it and talking about other things, or just pretending that he's doing a fantastic job and it's just the fake news and the George Soros funded Black Lives Matter anarchists who are trying in the deep state, who are trying to take him down.
Well, this is fascinating stuff, and I guess we'll find out. I mean, they're going to be there. I think they're sort of the archetype of I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, aren't they? In terms of his supporters.
Mm-hmm. Yes, many of them are.
Well, we will see. Sarah Posner, the book is Unholy: Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. We will put a link to this at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Sam.